NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era, 1987. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening and welcome to episode 27 of our series The Other Day 1961 to 1991 Current Era. Events, people and occurrences that defined a lifestyle. Things that you can't imagine us without, let alone comprehend. Another year, another episode. Today we're going to cover 1987, Dr. Hyder's hunger strike, Yakovlev and Ligachev, self-financing, the Memory Society, Rozenbaum, state quality control, Telebridges, Yeltsin expelled from the Politburo, Liu Bears and Punks, Rust's landing, Brodsky receives the Nobel Prize. Commenting we have economic expert Egor Gaidar, political expert Sergei Karaganov, author Anatoly Strelyany, Central Committee member, Foreign Affairs Minister Raoul Leroy and other officials. Georgian film director Tengiz Abuladze presents his movie Repentance that was filmed 3 years earlier. This allegorical tale about a dictator in a black Mussolini-style outfit with a Hitler mustache and a Beria-like monocle is presented as the Perestroika's flagship movie. He was awarded first prize at the All-Union Film Festival, the Cannes Grand Prix, and a Lenin Prize for his trilogy The Plea, The Wishing Tree, and Repentance. His colleagues joked that they might as well have given him a Stalin Prize. No, he must not get a proper burial. Let him be feed for the crows. Putting him into the ground means turning a blind eye to everything that he's done. The pastry chef lady is explaining to the court why she keeps unearthing the corpse of their deceased ruler. Speaking in old Soviet terms, of which the viewers were reminded by a newspaper, the film's heroine was the daughter of a public enemy. I was meant to dig a tunnel from Bombay to London. A particularly striking scene was that of logs being delivered to a southern town from up north, bearing names of prison laborers, serving as notes that they were alive. I'm Mironov Bashi. I found him. I found him. One of the most important concepts of that era, alongside the primary Perestroika and Glasnost, were actually the name of that film and multiple times rethought phrases from its finale, about the street or road in other translations that either leads or does not lead to a church. Excuse me, does this road lead to the church? This is Varlam Street, not the one that leads to the church. What use is it then? What use is there for a road that doesn't lead to the church? In 1987, a couple of new Soviet subcompact-class cars appear. They begin production of the Oka in Serpukhov and the Tavria in Zaporozhye. Here's a car like you've never seen before. The tiny Oka was meant to accommodate 4 people, though even a person of average height could barely fit in the back. Apparently those were child seats then, while the Oka itself was for a young family. The car never became popular, particularly among the youth, and so it was tailored to the handicapped. The Tavria was a poor man's Samara. The Union's most affordable and thrifty automobile was mostly purchased by first-time car buyers, but it was really only fit for city service, since a fully loaded Tavria could barely make it up an incline. In early 1987, the USSR was paid official visit by the UK's Prime Minister. Prior to flying out of Moscow, Margaret Thatcher claimed this to be one of the most fascinating and invigorating trips to a foreign country she had ever made as Prime Minister. The interview that Thatcher gave to 3 political commentators and was aired on Central Television proved to be a fatal blow to Soviet international journalism. The esteemed guest was greeted at Vnukovo Airport by Chairman of the Soviet Council of Ministers Ryzhkov, USSR Foreign Affairs Minister Shevardnadze, Gorbachev tried to convince Thatcher that Great Britain needed to reduce its nuclear arsenal. Thatcher agreed to cutting back on medium-range missiles, otherwise she stood her ground. She wasn't too impressed by the Perestroika, reminded us about Afghanistan and Soviet dissidents. She made laughingstock out of those interviewers who tried explaining to her the advantages of a planned economy. A certain Muscovite offered the Prime Minister to come visit them at home, and she accepted. At this point, our people adored Thatcher, placing her even higher than Reagan in the international hierarchy.
Это был самый великолепный и вдохновляющий визит, который я когда-либо совершала за рубеж в качестве премьер-министра. И я хотела бы поблагодарить господина Горбачева, советское правительство и народ за столь теплый прием.
In 1987, a campaign was launched to restore historic city names. The first to get its old name back was Izhevsk. For 3 years, people jokingly called it Dmitry Fyodorovich, with it having been renamed to Ustinov in honor of the late defense minister. Soon after, they'd rename Brezhnev back to Naberezhnye Chelny, and they'd return the name Cheryamushki to the Brezhnev district in Moscow. Once the stagnation-era heroes were all accounted for, they went after the October and Stalin-era actors. They erased the last names of Kuibyshev, Gorky, Kalinin, Ordzhonikidze, and Zhdanov from the map, though for whatever reason they didn't restore Kirov's maiden name Vyatka. The city that endured the most suffering happened to be Rybinsk, in Yaroslavl province. In sequence, it bore the names Rybinsk, Sherbakov, then Rybinsk again, then Andropov, and finally Rybinsk. 1987 was the year when business was legalized in the USSR, despite them continuing to parrot that private entrepreneurship is not the Soviet way. A law was passed on self-employment. The Council of Ministers issued 2 decrees on joint ventures and 3 on establishing cooperatives in the field of services, public catering, and production of goods. Joint ventures were the slowest to emerge, with only 37 founded that year. We had cheap labor costs and plentiful resources, but joint ventures were just too heavily regulated. Profit had to be reinvested, foreign currency on their accounts was frozen, and the Soviet partner was always right. Founding documents took 9 months to prepare, with visas required from the Ministry of Finance, the State Labor Committee, Gosplan, the KGB. They also demanded estimates up to the year 2015, a lucky exception being the deli restaurant at Krasnaya Presnya. In this case, it took 1 day to found a joint enterprise, just in time for Rajiv Gandhi's visit. Meanwhile, self-employment was developing way more vigorously. Individual entrepreneurs were allowed to build and renovate housing, repair cars, run barbershops, cosmetic and photo salons, do tutoring, livery service. The first wave of cooperation was forwarded by clothing peddlers and kebab chefs. As for the epicenters, those were the Rishsky Market, where they sold the latest, trendiest clothes, copper bracelets, and pins with apolitical inscriptions, and Kropotkinskaya Street, formerly and soon to be Prachistinka. There you had the most civilized of the new public catering spots, the cooperative restaurant. Rishsky Market was a flattering way to put it, when in reality craftsmen and cooperators were given space on the street next to either end of the facility. Cooperators were introducing new colors to Soviet street fashion. Most people used to prefer that on which you couldn't see dirt, which gave way to pink and acid green dresses with stitching and buttons. Men were offered gray buttoned blousons. Both men and women could get banana pants made from beige raincoat fabric. 1 season later, the latest Rishsky Market craze was silk skirts and trousers, and Pyramida jeans with a label depicting a camel. Moscow's first cooperative restaurant, Kropotkinskaya 36. Western journalists writing about the dawn of Russian capitalism confidently called this a private establishment. In terms of media coverage, entire volumes were written about their first year of operation. This made the restaurant into Moscow's #1 attraction, which every affluent guest just had to come and visit. When US President Reagan's son was in Moscow as a reporter for Playboy magazine, he would prefer breakfast at Kropotkinskaya 36 to that served at the old-timey National Hotel. Central Television covered the American guests' culinary adventures in great detail. Public catering cooperatives tended to be accused of buying out produce, which was already a rare commodity, at state prices, particularly meat. Rebuttals in defense of cooperative enterprises were to the effect of, nobody's forcing you to go there. Besides, they're all about cozy interiors and quality home cooking. Nobody ever bothered to argue against the latter point, since nobody was insisting that state-owned cafeterias served good-tasting food. A lot of the cooperatives immediately began to suck blood from the public sector. Toothpaste used to cost 30 kopecks in a state-owned shop, while the next-door cooperative store sold it for a ruble. If we were to be brutally honest, the state-owned sector was handed over to cunning private parties for profiteering. This agitated the people's envy, with the primary expression of said envy being the militia types. I used to work for a famous magazine, and I had a hand in founding one of Moscow's first co-ops. This was a restaurant established by an adventurous author. His intent was to create a spot for poets, artists, where they could read poetry and host exhibitions. But as we all know, instead of artists, these places were visited by mafia types and the local militia. In the rank of lieutenant colonel or colonel, they'd have a drink with some snacks, and suggest that these co-ops were a scheme in order to determine who was for capitalism, to identify and punish those scoundrels. But why weren't co-ops immediately swept away by a wave of public contempt? By the wrath of the people, so to speak, which is always righteous, as we all know. All because authorities weren't able to exploit that wave. The militia types were wrong, and Gorbachev had different plans. Until authorities or the opposition are able to spearhead the people's jealousy, there's really nothing to worry about. Soviet propaganda's final American hero, Dr. Hyder sitting in front of the White House on hunger strike demanding they dismantle the nuclear arsenal. 56-year-old Charles Hyder used to do research on the sun. Then he posed an ultimatum to the US president, and after receiving no answer, he declared a hunger strike, which he claimed he was willing to see through to the death. Soviet reporters were astonished by Dr. Hyder's daily ration, which consisted of 1 to 2 gallons of warm water. Evidently, he was determined to fight until it was over. His hunger strike was dramatized in typical Soviet fashion. 6,000 female workers from the Tiraspol Tailoring Association wrote a letter to Reagan urging him to save the life of Dr. Hyder. Time was going by, Reagan remained silent, Hyder carried on. Soviet reporters in DC month after month tuned in from Lafayette Park, and even they were hard-pressed to explain Hyder's vitality. The doctor's strike lasted for 9 months, and after he'd had his fill, he announced that he would be running for president as an independent candidate, though our media decided to gloss over that part. In 1987, an article came out in Moskovsky Komsomolets titled White Dance, followed by an entire series of newspaper articles. This was the first time that they openly admitted that Moscow and later other Soviet cities harbored hookers. This meant adding the term prostitution to legislature in Russia, the Baltic states, and certain other countries. It was punishable by a 100 to 200 ruble fine, or 1 to 2 nights' worth of revenue. Before that, prostitutes used to be charged for reselling clothes or foreign currency-related fraud, with militia reports labeling them as women with low social accountability. From then on, they began to monitor prostitutes, of which there were over 1,000 operating in Moscow, and they even formed a vice police squad in Riga. Newspapers were eager to introduce the dark side of the good life to their readers. As it turned out, ladies of the night moved from the top of the service ladder down. The top tier was those who served foreigners for hard currency. A step below that, you had patriots who slept with sailors, northern shift workers, and officers on vacation. Then you had those who traveled across the country with truckers. Train station whores were at the bottom of the hierarchy. Reader's mail suggested sending fallen women into exile to the north, to prison, or to work at farms. Those who earned as much every night as a blue-collar worker did in a month were especially despised. Zhvanetsky's take on the matter. Turns out that some girls sold themselves, sometimes for big money, well before any laws were passed on self-employment. Ashamed of yourselves? Me? No. Couldn't care less. Something you want to say to me? Glasnost paved the way for new leaders among periodicals, which were called the grandstands of the Perestroika. The #1 newspaper was the weekly Moscow News, run by Egor Yakovlev. The #1 magazine was Oganek, run by Vitaly Korotich. A lucky few got them in the mail while others rushed to newsstands to buy them, passing them on to others for them to read. The Moscow News editorial office would have their latest issues on display in front of their building, and after dusk people would read them with the help of flashlights, matches, and lighters. Even the brief course on the history of the Communist Party, which was criticized by Moscow News and Oganek, even that had fewer mentions of Stalin than these two outlets. The lead authors were children of the 20th Congress, who were trying to continue what earlier Soviet liberals had started, namely to set everything straight with the past, empower the press to cover all events in the present, and, in continuing the feud between Slavophiles and pro-Westerners, argue with the Russian traditionalist magazine Nash Savremennik about the future of the motherland. Moscow News was undermining the traditions of Soviet journalism. The country's best writers saw nothing wrong in putting together pieces that were 2 to 3 pages long. Turns out that the Russian language did allow for concisely outlining any issue. I never knew it could be like this. Thank you. 60 years after they put an end to infighting within the Communist Party, in 1987 the folks who were well versed in politics split into 2 camps, supporters of either Yegor Ligachev or Alexander Yakovlev. One represented the conservative, the other the Perestroika-oriented wing of the Politburo, and both sides criticized Gorbachev for his half-heartedness. Perestroika policies were announced without any serious analysis. And I'm directly quoting. Ligachev berating everybody's favorite Perestroika-era journalism for being out of line and smearing. He kept repeating that we lost control of the press. Other conservatives included Gromyko, Salamin, Voratnikov, Chebrikov. Yakovlev was admitted to the Politburo in June. Now the party had 2 primary ideologues. Yakovlev supported radical media outlets, the Union of Cinematographers, experiments in theater. Shevardnadze was also considered one of the leading liberals in power, as was Medvedev to a lesser extent. Meanwhile, Gorbachev was maneuvering and either calling for pluralism or bringing up a single-party approach. In 1987, the country's primary drama theater, the Moscow Art Theater, also known as the MKHAT, split into 2 separate ones. One of them was located at Art Theater Drive, formerly M2B Kemergersky Lane, and the second at Tverskoy Boulevard. One was run by Yefremov, the other by Doronina, male and female. It all started with a reorganization plan proposed by art director Oleg Yefremov. A 160-person troupe was too unruly, while the theater had 2 scenes. A staff meeting was held where the majority rejected the plan. Yefremov secured the support of almost every art theater star and the new influential force of the time, the liberal media. And in the opposition, you had the less popular close to half of the troupe under Tatiana Doronina. Doronina's art theater proved to be oppositional and patriotic, while Yefremov's stayed true to classic canon, and to viewing the modern day through the lens of traditional realism. Both camps prevailed, but neither dominated the scene. Break a leg. In 1987, the Soviet prosecutor's office arrests Yuri Churbanov. This served as the latest confirmation for the phrase, "Don't count out a prison cell, a begging bowl might come as well." Former First Deputy Internal Affairs Minister, General Colonel and husband to Galina Brezhneva, Churbanov turned out to be the most notable of the Moscow-based cotton case culprits. The most high-profile criminal case of the Perestroika era brought down Uzbekistan's entire elite class, while elevating the lead investigators, Telman Gdlian and Nikolai Ivanov, to political star status. Their last names would be merged into one, becoming a symbol of the battle against corruption in upper echelons of government. The cotton case began under Andropov, when they arrested executives and experts from Uzbekistani cotton ginneries who were caught bribing management of the Serpukhov cotton mill. As it turned out, the latter were forging documentation on receiving raw material. Investigators would soon find out that 10,000 rubles for a carload of fictitious cotton was standard industry practice, and a lot of that money was going to the Sunny Republic. A team of investigators was sent over from Moscow. An estimated total of 1.5 billion rubles was suspected to have been embezzled. In a country of shockingly poor kishlaks, they confiscated literally piles of money and gold. In Moscow, they even put the seized valuables up on display for the media and television. A series of cases involved thousands of people from Uzbekistan, including high-ranking local law enforcement. The Internal Affairs Minister himself committed suicide before they could get to him. The Republican chairman of the Council of Ministers, 8 regional committee secretaries, and 4 central committee secretaries. It was obvious that the cotton mafia had to have a patron in Moscow. Former Internal Affairs Minister Shalikov was dead, and nobody better to make an example of than former First Deputy, the famous Churbanov. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, of which he served 6. I ask that you at least believe me when I tell you this. Here before the court, I was being absolutely honest. Stories about how cotton or white gold was being turned into the ordinary sort shocked the 150-ruble population. It was clear that, quote, they were all in on it, and that even Moscow was involved. Now even people from the Midlands were aware of the last names Usman Kadjayev and Huday Beriev, though it was Churbanov's prosecution that attracted the most attention, him being Brezhnev's son-in-law and Andropov's convict. The national economy continued to deteriorate. In 1987, they decided that all problems were down to the squandering of funds being distributed by the center and to ineffective local management. In dealing with these issues, work collectives took it upon themselves to elect their companies' directors, while the companies themselves started moving towards self-funding. The first election of a new director took place in Jelgava, Latvia, at the RAF factory where they made the Soviet Union's #1 minivan. 3,026 applications were sent by everybody from young weavers and scientists to teachers, high schoolers, and of course workers. 20 candidates were invited to come over for a visit, out of which 5 started campaigning, just like in movies about the West. Meetings where they'd elaborate on programs, articles in local newspapers. 2 people made it to the final tour, with Viktor Bosser, a company director from Omsk, taking the win in the final round. Most other collectives would elect their directors not wanting anything to change, under the guise of ensuring the stability of their own enterprises. The whole self-funding experiment didn't really change anything. Companies were more than happy to keep any profits for themselves, but they were still reaching out to the government to fund their development, since any debt would be written off anyway. This led to even deeper economic imbalances. In August of 1987, during 2 weeks of touring the Baltic states, Moscow's Satire Theater loses 2 of its lead actors. The Soviet Union mourned movie stars Anatoly Papanov and Andrei Mironov. By the end of the year, they released the last movies featuring the nation's favorite actors: The Cold Summer of 1953 and A Man from the Boulevard des Capucines. During a break between plays, Anatoly Papanov traveled to Moscow to film for a movie. My only regret? The years. Papanov, who played strong-willed characters his entire career, had a bad heart. The 64-year-old actor died after suffering from yet another heart attack on August 5th. The theater tour carried on. Plays with Papanov were substituted for creative gatherings with Mironov. I really want to lead a normal life. To work. Anatoly Dmitrievich Papanov. His final shot. When a person has a goal in life, he needs not fear death. On August 14th, while playing in The Marriage of Figaro, after the line "She prefers me to you," Mironov collapses onto the stage. He had suffered a stroke. 2 days later, he passes away at 46 years of age. The people lost their beloved idol, a man who was unrivaled in the roles of troublemakers throughout all of history. Billy, Lock and Load. In 1987, the first issue of Burda Moden magazine was released in Russian. Worldwide acclaim in the realm of fashion coming out of Germany is how the publication advertised itself to Soviet women. But this magazine wasn't about models haute couture. Instead, it contained samples for do-it-yourself weaving. Every issue began with a Between Us Ladies styled foreword by elegantly aged magazine founder and editor Frau Anne Burda. Burda Moden was a breakthrough, leading women to a different life. Precise samples allowed for easily weaving great-fitting clothes. The very first issue already contained 48 models, which Soviet women received simultaneously with European housewives. The magazine also instructed how to measure, do a face massage, dry flowers, and tie scarves into ribbons. Before they built a printing house in Lianozovo, the Russian version was printed in Germany, in runs of 100,000 copies selling for 5 rubles apiece, which were never freely available. All of the country's large-scale manufacturing facilities became subject to external quality control starting in 1987, conducted on behalf of the state. The number of quality control experts was gradually increased to 50,000 nationwide. State quality control bodies reported the quantity of defective goods, and all while turning the shortcomings of the companies they supervised to their own benefit. Given widespread deficit and a lack of competition, state quality control, regardless of it being nominally independent from manufacturers, was never destined to impartially represent the consumer. According to official data for 1986, a mere 12% of goods produced by Soviet industry met international standards, which dropped to 9% in 87 and then to 7% in 88.
Low quality of goods was something socialism was notorious for. It was the butt of many jokes. Here's a popular anecdote from later Soviet years. Riddle me this. It buzzes, flies, but doesn't get into your ear. The answer, a Soviet flying buzzer for entering the ear. This was, of course, something that the new team assembled by Gorbachev and Ryzhkov was not willing to tolerate. He had already launched the Uskoreniya campaign, and now it was time to tend to quality. The problem was that, within the framework of socialism, this is something that cannot be resolved. There is really no need to improve quality with there being a shortage of goods anyway. People would buy anything, so this was all nonsense on behalf of leadership. And so they had to resort to a tried and tested bureaucratic method. Let's create a new and bloated bureaucratic body that would specifically be tasked with monitoring the quality of goods, and with punishing whoever was to blame for any problems. This was similar to the military supervision system, authorized to control quality for the military-industrial complex. However, what barely got the job done, in a sector of the economy that had special privileges, when applied to the entire national economy, ultimately turned out to be a large-scale, dragged-out, and costly joke. No revolution in quality ever came about, though it did lead to a noticeable decline in production output. 1987 was a year when documentaries attracted almost as much, if not more, public interest than fiction. Some of the better-known titles, The Peasant from Arkhangelsk and Is It Easy to Be Young? These films shocked the people and outraged the ideological masterminds. The Peasant from Arkhangelsk was Nikolai Sivkov, the first Soviet farmer whose family brought up 60 calves under an agreement with the local state farm. I am in dire need, so they gave me calves, right? But they keep stalling when it comes to the equipment. They've put us into a situation when they're like, you either take what you're given or don't. That's all you're gonna get from us. The creators Anatoly Strelyany and Marina Goldovskaya sang an anthem to the kulak class. Even right-leaning folks never showed such admiration for villagers, who hadn't been so revered since the time of Stolypin. The Arkhangelsk Regional Committee was able to cancel the rerun that had already been announced, though later the film did receive a state prize. Meanwhile, in a film studio in Riga, Juris Podnieks puts together a portrait gallery of the first generation of people living in relative freedom.
Youngsters saw a reflection of themselves, while the grown-ups were unable to recognize the youth, contemplating their own responsibility for said youth in the media. Kids from the stairwell make it out onto the streets. They were now coming together to make non-formal youth organizations, as opposed to the formal union, which was the Komsomol. The ones that stood out were the rockers, heavy metalists, punks, a new generation of hippies, plus a group that was unique to the capital, the Lyubers, who were taking over Moscow. Rockers were considered to be the greatest nuisance, with them preventing normal people from getting a good night's sleep. These midnight cowboys tore up the city streets, not having mufflers, tags, or driver's licenses. In 1987, night riders caused almost 300 accidents in Moscow alone, prompting most Soviet to ban groups of bikers from cruising between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. Moscow's traffic cops were issued BMW motorcycles as chase vehicles. Hippies, on the other hand, were the quietest bunch. They partied, sported worn-out jeans, canvas bags, jewelry, and sang to guitar music. The aggressive fans of punk rock or heavy metal were about spiked jackets and riveted wristbands. They did the rock and roll salute. They'd also always have the volume all the way up on their tape players, and they'd write on walls, "Heavy metal forever." Moscow's hippies, punks, and metalists were bullied by the Lyubers. These buff guys with short haircuts and short plaid trousers traveled to the city by train. They would move around in packs and purge Moscow of those who disgraced the traditional way of life. They cut off excess hair, tore off accessorized clothing, and simply beat up other non-formal youngsters. "Give it to me. Get over here." The Lyubers, the only original subculture, had their own ideology. They were all about a healthy lifestyle, fighting for the greater good, underground training facilities. According to their motto, their hometown of Lyubertsy was the center of Russia. At the Kazan train station, all of a sudden a hurrah, a training exercise? No, that's the Lyuberam. Today, the last fruit fly perished. In 1987, Moscow authorities tried putting an end to the hiring of out-of-town workers based on temporary registration. 23 years prior, when the city's population wasn't increasing fast enough to satisfy the growing demands of the labor market, enterprises were allowed to employ out-of-towners. They were given a quota that led to an influx of migrants. In Moscow, they called them limita. Most of them were involved in subway construction, at weaving mills, the sickle and hammer plant, AZLK, and ZIL. That last acronym was even jokingly interpreted as Exhausted Limit Workers Factory. During their first 3 months, out-of-towners were monitored by the militia. They were issued a 2-year temporary registration, with the possibility of adding another 2 years for good behavior. Only after that could they get a permanent registration, though a good half would never even make it through the first term. When they banned labor migration to the capital, authorities realized that Moscow natives weren't as easy to exploit, and so they made an exception for Metrostroy and Mintranstroy, who were still allowed to hire based on temporary registration. In keeping with the spirit of the time, throughout the course of 1987, Central Television released 3 new programs that defined the Perestroika in broadcasting. One of them, Vzгляд, was considered edgy, the other, Projector of Perestroika, dumb, the third, Tame, that was before and after midnight. The heads of the farming sector in Kalmykia have been fired. Projector of Perestroika would usually come out right after the Vremya newscast, as a sort of supplementary program. It unabashedly forwarded the public agenda, speaking of someone somewhere not keeping up with the Perestroika, or conversely about new trends actually seeing the light of day. That was also the time when late-night television became a thing. Once a month, the dazzling Vladimir Molchanov would make an appearance, accompanied by a lovely female co-host. They'd discuss beautiful topics and make mesmerizing hand gestures. Before and After Midnight was a true late-night show that kept the viewer wide awake. But the mass viewer truly fell in love with Vzгляд. The three presenters, Dmitry Zakharov, Vladislav Listyev, and Alexander Lyubimov, and the duo Vladimir Mukusev, Alexander Politkovsky. They were welcome in every household. Their subject matter was of interest to all. They had the best musical numbers, and they sometimes even criticized the government. Soviet TV had never seen such a dynamic and lively program. I'd like to introduce our first guest for tonight. He's a famous actor and film director. I guess you're a film director first and foremost. Please welcome Stanislav Govorukhin. Regulators paid careful attention to Vzгляд, sometimes editing out the really edgy stuff, or even canceling episodes altogether. Millions of people were now living from Friday to Friday. Activity report. We use only official documents. A patriotic movement called Memory, founded in the early 80s under the Ministry of Aviation, makes headlines by organizing a march in the center of Moscow. The protesters were met by First Secretary of Moscow's town committee Yeltsin. Dmitry Vasilyev, Memory's leader, and other activists in interviews and self-published articles spoke of orthodoxy, Bolshevism, and the battle against Judeo-Masons. A discussion was opened on the Perestroika awaking not only wholesome but also demented forces, on the need for separating true and false patriotism, with a side note that we mustn't tarnish the term patriot. Memory would tend to see a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy everywhere it looked. You could allegedly see the Star of David when looking through a newspaper. Moscow's subway was routed as to undermine the capital. Some thought the society to be restoring destroyed architectural monuments, but they were more well-known for their noisy gatherings, where you'd always find some middle-aged guy wearing a sweater with embroidery saying if you drink vodka, wine, or beer, you're supporting Tel Aviv. Salacious rumors were spreading about the ethnic composition of the Council of People's Commissars, on the hand that Jews had in the collectivization and demolition of churches, and on how rock, booze, and aerobics were corrupting the youth. Memory was a radical patriotic society, but they were supported by the more conservative patriots whose calling for traditionalism was something that authorities were obliged to honor. A strong personality in Soviet pop music, Alexander Rozenbaum looking to become as famous as Vysotsky. He was the well-known author of an underground music album titled Gopstop. Upon becoming a legitimate artist, Rozenbaum became the first of the professional musicians to sing about the war in Afghanistan. You couldn't wrap your head around the picture of a plane full of discharged soldiers falling to the ground while burning like a candle. Just 3 years prior, Rozenbaum was regarded as profane, but now he was producing 3 records at Melodia and giving concerts. He wrote music with simple lyrics, military ballads, and songs meant to resemble Cossack folk music.
Черные голоса, в окошке дома гуляй, да пой казачий дом. На ковре из желтых листьев.
Rozenbaum loved repeating that he used to work as a paramedic, and though he had a rational outlook on life, he was still a romantic at heart.
Подворотня, осень вальс Бостон отлетал, теплый день и хрипло пел саксофон.
Given a rapid increase in production, with millions of copies printed, Druzhba Narodov, Novy Mir, and Znamya magazines published social commentary works written 10 to 20 years prior. Perestroika fiction. The genre was best represented by Anatoly Rybakov's novel titled Children of the Arbat. For the first time, an authorized fiction book spoke of Stalin being a bad guy responsible for mass repressions. Rybakov was criticized for being too harsh and for a one-sided interpretation of historic events. He was also applauded for just that. The New Appointment by Alexander Beck, Bison by Daniel Granin, White Clothing by Vladimir Dudintsev, Life and Fate by Vitaly Grossman, The Inseparable Twins by Anatoly Pristavkin, In these thick magazine publications of various fictitiousness, subscribers were looking for the truth about Stalin and the shortcomings of socialism. A USSR fashion trend emerges in the West, with the former being seen as the most curious country out there. The words Perestroika and Glasnost weren't simply repeated by the entire civilized world, they were even spelled out in Cyrillic letters on t-shirts. Savvier Westerners even knew how to say new thinking in Russian. Gorbachev rises to massive fame. For the first time in history, the Soviet General Secretary was the most popular world leader, with him being called Gorby for short, similar to how Thatcher was called Maggie and Reagan Ronnie. Reagan, as always, stood with his people. In respect to disarming, he cited the Russian proverb, "Trust but verify." A book by Gorbachev came out back home and abroad titled Perestroika, New Thinking for Our Country and the World. The author claimed that his book was unfinished and could never be finished. The Perestroika was an attempt at establishing a new political philosophy. Typical reasoning was to the effect of the existing form of capitalism being unacceptable for any reasonable person in the West, and the active model of socialism seen by rational Soviet folks as being flawed. The Perestroika would supposedly give birth to a new model that everybody would accept. Gorbachev kept harping on the notion that socialism had yet to fully blossom. On May 25, 1987, at 6:45 p.m., a small plane, a Cessna 172P, lands on the Red Square right next to the Kremlin. The pilot was arrested immediately. He turned out to be a 19-year-old citizen of West Germany named Mathias Rust, and he claimed that he was on a mission of peace. The reason for choosing such an extravagant means of travel was for his message to make it to Mikhail Gorbachev. Rust took off that day in Helsinki. En route to the Soviet border, he descended to 200 feet and became invisible to Finnish radars. He threw a gasoline canister overboard, imitating a crash. He crossed the Soviet border nearby Kotlajärvi, at which point he set course for Moscow. Rust's initial plan was to land on the Red Square. He flew in from the Moscow River, began his descent, and realized that there were just too many tourists for him to land safely. That was when a foreign tourist caught Rust's plane on film using an amateur camcorder and continued to record all of his maneuvers. Rust made it to the historical museum, turned around, and flew right above the Kremlin wall and the mausoleum straight back to the Moscow River. There he made another U-turn and aimed to land on the Vasilyevsky descent. His plane made a few more circles here next to St. Basil's Cathedral and came to a halt. Rust's piloting skills would become subject to much debate, with him making such a successful flight from Finland to Moscow. Without a doubt, his landing was super clean, which was the main point of focus for our media. Him sticking a Chkalov-style aggressive landing, and that apparently in the West, essentially any kid could handle flying a plane. Rust's plane was approached by a Soviet interceptor as early as near Leningrad. No measures were taken and the plane returned to base. The tiny craft approaching Moscow was targeted multiple times by anti-aircraft defenses, but leadership wasn't issuing any orders, and lower-ranking commanders were unwilling to make the call themselves after the whole Korean Boeing scandal. People started calling the Vasilyevsky descent Sheremetyevo 3.
This was quite a humorous occurrence. A daring flight undertaken by who you'd call a young punk, speaking in modern terms, over the railroad connecting Moscow and Leningrad, with him then landing next to the Red Square. All of this bore severe political consequences. At the time, Gorbachev was facing serious opposition from the likes of the more conservative party activists, and especially fierce blowback from military types, who were naturally conservative and were not keen on reducing the defense budget, which was an absolute necessity as the country could no longer afford it. This led to Rust's arrival being used by Gorbachev and his team of liberals to undermine the authority of military leadership. One very honorable man was disgracefully sent into retirement. This was Marshal Sokolov, the last of the generals who had a hand in winning World War II. Anti-military hysteria escalated within Soviet society and in the media. As for this dramatic story, it ended on a farcical note. Given that Rust committed a crime, they had to put him in jail. But we were trying to build a friendship with West Germany, which made it a bit difficult to put him away. Ultimately, they grounded Rust for a little bit, and then they let him fly away. Central Television picks up a new fad, Telebridges. In 87 and 88, they staged a total of 14 transmissions between us and the West. Our friendship with the States meant that both sides had much to discuss. Communication satellites allowed our women to reach out to their women, to connect our journalists with their journalists. The main constructors of these bridges were Vladimir Posner and Phil Donahue. There was a wide range of topics up for discussion, starting with a possible joint mission to Mars, all the way up to national love life specifics. That's when the famous "there's no sex in the USSR" phrase was uttered. Phil Donahue was the first American star of Soviet TV. He was no different from the other Americans in the studio, while Vladimir Posner was conversely our shiniest example of a loose TV host that we presented to the West. Good morning, Vladimir, or rather good evening in your case.
Yes, good morning to you. Like you mentioned, we are located in Moscow, and we are very glad to welcome you to our gathering.
Posner spoke very good English, all while speaking Russian with lightly accented intonations. He earned a reputation of being a friend among foes and a foe among friends, being sort of an Ilya Ehrenberg, but on TV in the Gorbachev era.
Students at the journalism department.
However, the leaders of two superpowers agreed on the need for more active dialogue. In 1987, Moscow starts celebrating City Day. The last time the capital city had its own holiday was in 1947, which was its 800th anniversary. Now, starting at the semi-important number of 840, every year it would be congratulated with its birthday in early September. City Day involved mass festivities. Just like at a big fair, you'd see artists all dressed up, strongmen, trumpeters. A Greeting the Time of Moscow parade went around the garden ring. Yuri Dolgoruki and Dmitry Donskoy Druzhinas, Red Guard and Metro Stroy squads, the drama theater performing at the Manish Square, the Bolshoi Theater troupe singing next to St. Basil's Cathedral. All of these celebrations completely rearranged hometown patriotism, with all of Russia's best being in Moscow, and Moscow representing all of the best that Russia had to offer. Some sow, others plow, some build or forge. And who here will outdance whom? Or manage to outsing? At the October 1987 Central Committee plenary meeting, candidate for Politburo membership and first secretary of Moscow's town committee Yeltsin harshly criticizes the doings of the Politburo. He was condemned by fellow party members and pitied by the people, to the effect of, the one honest man to stand up to the partocracy ended up suffering for it. Prior to the October plenary meeting, Yeltsin's name was up there with comrades Vorotnikov, Zykov, and Ryzhkov. Rumors about his report began circulating immediately after the meeting, though no official statements were made. They didn't want to spoil the mood for the celebrations commemorating 70 years since October, where Yeltsin was present as if nothing even happened. On November 11th, a town committee plenary meeting was held in Moscow, where Yeltsin was completely picked apart. Meanwhile, Yeltsin's CK Plenum report, which caused the commotion in the first place, wasn't even officially published, and was being distributed in Moscow by amateur publishers. Yeltsin was obviously forced to step down, and having effectively attained martyrdom, was appointed as USSR Minister, First Deputy Chairman of USSR Gosstroy. People were told that Yeltsin had suffered a heart attack, and that Gorbachev's parting words for him were, "I will never let you back into politics." In 1987, the Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded to a Russian poet named Joseph Brodsky, who had moved to the United States 15 years prior. Brodsky was the fifth Russian author to receive a Nobel Prize. In 3 of the 4 instances prior to Brodsky, the prestigious trophy was apparently more than just a prize for literary achievements, though to others the fact that Sholokhov received one of these in 1965 also looked like a political gesture. However, even Soviet readers who were used to not separating books from politics saw this as a peculiar situation, with both of the 2 last living Russian laureates being in American exile. Our media simply stated the fact that Brodsky received the prize, without giving any details. The very first time his poetry was legally published in the motherland coincided with the award ceremony, when the former was featured in the December issue of Novy Mir.
And that was 1987 in our show the other day, 1961 to 1991, current era. Events, people, and occurrences that defined a lifestyle. Next time, we'll be featuring 1988, Nagorno-Karabakh, Assam, Reagan's visit to Moscow, 1,000 years since the Christianization of Rus, AIDS, Nina Andreeva's letter, bullying in the army, the first beauty pageant, DDT Kino Nautilus, People's Fronts in the Baltic States, Bukharin exonerated, an earthquake in Armenia, Laskavi May, Little Vera. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.